when they awakened out of the thick clouds of medically induced anesthesia, many women inside of the Irwin County Detention Center still remained in the dark about what exactly had been done to their bodies. Shamika McKay was among the many left without answers. Before she was illegally detained in an ICE facility, McKay was a registered nurse who had been living in the United States for over 21 years. Most of her family, including her eldest sister and her grandmother, still lived in the United States at the time. Shamika had not been to Jamaica since she was 16 years old and had no living relatives in Jamaica, yet it was where the United States government threatened to deport her, a country in which she had no familial ties. Her first night inside of ICE custody was a horrible, out-of-body experience. She says, quote, "I was afraid to touch anything. It was disgusting, it was dirty, and it was filthy. They don't clean and they don't sanitize in there. There's just a lot of rusting paint, just chipping away at us. And a lot of that paint had lead in it." Shamika's description echoes the Project South report, which described the facility as having one shower and bathroom for more than 50 people, spoiled food that contained cockroaches along with ants, and medical examination rooms, floors, and patient examination tables that were dirty, dusty, and molded. It was these exact conditions in which Shamika was operated on without her informed consent. Shamika was told in an urgent life or death manner that she needed to be operated on. Hours later, when she stepped off of the operating table, she still experienced heavy anxieties from the lack of answers as to what was being done to her body, except this time she was post-surgery and permanently haunted by a torturous feeling of the unknown. When I spoke with Pauline Benham, her story sounded eerily similar to Shamika's. Pauline Benham is a Cameroonian-American woman who came to the U.S. when she was just 3 years old. After being detained in Irwin, Dr. Mahindra Amin scheduled her to have a dilation and a curettage procedure, which he said would help cure her of a problem she had never had in the outside world, which was cysts on her ovaries. Much like he told McKay, he told Benham that the procedure would remove the cysts by scraping them from her fallopian tubes. But on August 23, 2019, when Pauline woke up from her surgery, Dr. Amin told her that he was able to remove the blocking in her fallopian tubes and that her right tube was worse, so he had cut it off. He also told her that she will not be able to have kids naturally anymore, only through IVF. Pauline Benham, still in shock, cried. Pauline Benham, still in shock, cried. Medical consent. A category that American history books have routinely failed in recording the voices and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx women, while simultaneously succeeding in downplaying the pain and the trauma that has been historically inflicted upon our communities for so long. As Jamil Fields, who is director of Women's Initiative at the Center for American Progress, says, quote unquote, "How we got here is the product of our current climate with ICE, but it's also a product of how long we have had a history of coercion that has gone unchecked and unrecognized. It comes up in the media in instances like this, and then people forget about it and it goes away." But lack of medical consent for BIPOC women didn't stop with Sims. In fact, it carried over for centuries after. Over the years, we've seen this continued abuse of power take on different shapes and forms between different state lines. Between 1929 to 1974 in North Carolina, about 5,000 involuntary involuntary sterilizations were performed on young, low-income Black women who were either coerced by the threat of revoking monetary assistance needed to survive and health care. In Puerto Rico, between 1930s and 1970s, a third of Puerto Ricans' female population was sterilized in a government attempt to, quote, reduce poverty and make Puerto Rico economically successful. Between the 1960s and the 1970s, Indian Health Services forcibly sterilized thousands of Native American girls across the United States as young as 11 years old, who were not made aware that they were being sterilized and were told that the procedure would be reversible. And as recently as 2017, there was a time when the United States jails and prisons were giving women reduced sentences if they would sterilize or use a specific form of 4-year contraceptive known as the Norplant implant. This pattern, Hafsa Al-Amin, program coordinator at CA Coalition for Women Prisoners, describes, is quote-unquote systematic neglect that rises to the level of state violence. I say rises to the level of state violence because with state violence, those things happen when people are aware and they're seen and acknowledged and accepted. Wooten says that her initial complaint was about not having the proper PPE. Wooten described the facility's conditions as unsafe to both workers and detainees. These conditions, she says, were commonly overlooked by those in charge. Wooten describes women as young as 23 years old who were operated on without informed consent, a pattern she claims she observed frequently inside of Irwin. She described it as a dismal cycle that left many people with a notable change in their physical disposition and energy. Much like the Puerto Rican, Native American, and Black women who were sterilized throughout the 1930s and the 1970s, what Ms. Wooten described inside of the facility was intentional misguidance and deception being at the core of most of the medical abuse inside of Irwin Detention Center. Due to the language barriers, many of the women had no understanding of what was being done, and many had no one to explain the procedures to them. It can be said that the conditions at ICE parallel the age-old ideas that in order for something to live, there has to be an ecosystem in place that enables it to survive. The same can be said for systems that enable abuse. Ultimately, Ms. Wooten cited fear and retaliation as two of the major factors that allowed these medical injustices to continue. During this time, Dawn remembers many nurses in the facility staying silent or agreeing to shred paperwork due to the high firing rate and turnover rate against those who did file complaints. However, it was the detained women who were forced to suffer the worst forms of retaliation for speaking up and asking questions. Dwayne Thomas, a former correctional officer at Irwin Detention Center, echoed these sentiments. Although Thomas oversaw the male detainees at Irwin, he stated that failures in medical happened on a widespread level, with one of the major failures being response time. He says, quote, "When I was called for medical, it took them 20 to 30 minutes just to get to the building." This time frame, Dwayne said, occurred regularly. In fact, quote, it was plenty of times. I mean, and I worked at the facility before COVID hit. And so I saw all of this happen before COVID hit. The only thing it did was get worse. Dabney Evans, who is director of the Center for Humanitarian Emergencies at Emory University and a mixed methods researcher and professor of issues affecting vulnerable populations at the intersection of public health and human rights, states that the medical abuse is a result of systems much bigger than the internal building affairs. She says, quote, this brings up this idea of what we call dual loyalty. Basically, if you have a doctor who was employed by the state, they, immigration detention center doctors, are a state actor. They are part of the government. Their job is to balance two sets of interests. The first set of interests is their professional obligation to their patients with their obligation to their employer, which is in this case the state. And so we have to think about how those two things might be a point of tension. Oftentimes, women who have language barriers are forced to deal with doctors who have a shady past. Much like Dr. Amin, who was the subject of a Justice Department investigation in 2015 due to making false claims to Medicaid and Medicare prior to his mishandling at ICE, Dabney says by ignoring his past DOJ case, Amin's ability to reach a $525,000 civil settlement with the DOJ was an early sign of a flawed system that lacked accountability for marginalized people. According to Alexandra Stern, who was the director of Sterilization and Social Justice Lab, she says, quote, all too often, mechanisms of accountability are not clearly articulated so that no one ultimately can take the blame, and the proverbial buck is passed from one point to the next. Dabney says that Dabney says what Dr. Amin used to get away with malpractice was essentially the argument of, well, I never really meant to hurt anyone. I was just trying to be a good doctor. I didn't break the Hippocratic Oath. So even though there was a pattern of abuse, and even though women were coerced into sterilization, they didn't win the case, which is a huge slap in the face to them, but shows how hard it can be to win these types of cases.